I recently wanted to build some new jumping equipment for our outdoor arena, but had a hard time finding good plans for how to do it. So I Googled around a bit and came up with some specs and wanted to share the build process here. I wanted to build 3 sets of simple jump standards using fairly basic tools and equipment. Luckily, this project is pretty doable even without a lot of woodworking or carpentry skills. The first step was measuring the 18-inch segments from my 2x8 boards. These will become the base for my standards. Each set of standards uses one 12-foot 2x8 for the base and an 8-foot 4x4 for the uprights. Obviously, since I was making 3 sets, I picked up 3 of each type of lumber. These standards will live outdoors full time, so I opted to use pressure-treated wood for this project. The home center cut my 12-foot pieces in half for me, then I made the rest of the cuts myself back at the barn. I used a circular saw to cut all the base pieces to size, though a table or track saw would also work. Each individual base requires 4 pieces, 8 pieces per set. Since I was making 3 sets, this was a lot of cutting. Once all the base pieces were cut, I used a speed square to trace an angle onto the ends of each one for cutting a taper. This may seem like just a design feature, but it's actually really important for safety reasons. The taper replaces the sharp 90-degree point with more blunt angles, in case a horse or rider steps or falls onto the standard. It also looks nicer and reduces a bit of the bulk. So even though it's a lot more cutting, it's still worth it. Plus, it's super satisfying to see these pieces start taking a recognizable shape. The actual measurements don't really seem to matter so long as they're consistent throughout the entire project. I just used my eye to decide what looked the best, then got to work cutting. Then I took my 8-foot 4x4s and cut each in half to create 2 4-foot uprights per set. This is probably something the home center could have done for me too, honestly, but it was easy enough to do myself. Unfortunately, my circular saw was a little small for this particular task, so I had to make multiple cuts across each edge of the 4x4s before they finally split into halves. This left a little nub in the middle, but that was easily filed off later. After that, I measured an inch from the top of each upright to cut a bevel. I did this using my circular saw with its base adjusted to the 45-degree setting. Adding the bevel helps make the standards look a little more finished and softens the edges a bit for anyone who has to move them around. It might also help the standards last longer out in the elements. I wasn't super precise with my measurements or cuts, and it didn't really seem to matter. But if I did it again, I'd probably cut the bevel about half an inch from the end instead of a full inch. I did this with one set and it just looked a little cleaner, plus any unevenness in my cutting was less obvious. With all the pieces cut to size, the standards were just about ready for assembly. Before attaching the bases, however, we had to add the pinholes for the jump cups. My woodworker friend helped me out by making a jig that would guide the drill to keep it straight, and that has the holes pre-cut and measured at 3-inch intervals. Originally, I tried to cut the holes into these wet pressure-treated 4x4s using a 1/2-inch auger bit and my cordless drill. This turned out to be way harder than I expected, and the auger kept wanting to get stuck. So we set that aside until I could get a different bit for the job. With the pinholes and actual assembly on hold, I set about pre-drilling screw holes into the feet. We chose a drill bit that was just a bit smaller than the 3-inch exterior decking screws I planned to use. You don't need exact measurements on diameter or anything, just hold the screw behind the bit and you should still be able to see the threads around the edges. Pre-drilling the holes isn't absolutely necessary either, but it's useful for preventing any splits when you go to drive the screws in during final assembly. For this project, I plan to attach the base feet with 2 screws each, but if I did it again, I might go with 4. 2 screws were plenty sturdy, but as you all may know, these standards can sometimes take a beating, especially when they get dragged around the arena. 4 screws would just give them a little more durability against any lateral forces. I finally made it back to the hardware store and picked up a 1/2-inch spade bit to drill the pinholes into the uprights. I also used a hammer drill for this job, which is kind of overkill, but it worked for me and made light work of this task. I spaced the holes every 3 inches, starting at 12 inches and going up to 3'6". The jig was helpful for making the task go by quickly, but over time the holes in the jig got a bit blown out. It would be just as easy to measure and mark the holes yourself without a jig. Again though, since I was making 3 complete sets of standards, it was a lot of holes to drill, 60 total, so efficiency was key. Depending on your needs, you might be making a taller or shorter standard, and so can use more or fewer pinholes. Just depends on what size jumps you want to be able to do. These standards will be living at a barn with a busy lesson program, so it's important for them to be versatile for riders at all levels. Overall, it would have been a lot easier to drill these holes with a more appropriate workbench and more clamps. This setup was a little tall for me, especially for getting leverage on the drill, but we made do. Finally, nothing was left but to assemble the base onto the uprights. Again, I used 3-inch exterior decking screws for this project and a normal cordless drill. Maybe with a proper workbench, this would have been easier, but as it was kind of awkward getting the feet onto each upright at first. Eventually, it occurred to me that I could get all the screws started in their base pieces first, then have a free hand to hold everything together for assembly. Again, more clamps would have also helped, or at least a bigger clamp. My one and only clamp is only 6 inches and couldn't fit over everything once the base was partially assembled. No big deal though, and all the screws went in super smoothly with the pre-drilled holes. This was hands down the easiest part of the build, aside from cutting all the pieces to size. And obviously it was super satisfying to see the standards come together. I tested all the pinholes with 2 different types of jump cups to make sure that everything fit, and I also smoothed out the bevels on each upright with a block plane. The lumber used for this project is pressure treated and will need to dry for a few months to a year before painting, but in the meantime they're all finished and ready to go to work. This project was super fun and a great way for me to learn more about making jumping equipment. Hope you enjoyed watching this and hope you get to make some jumps yourself too.